Yes, there was such a thing as global warming, but it was not man-made, it was caused by the sun. The sun's global warming broke the little ice age, and it lasted for nearly 300 years. It ended in the late 1990s. This grand global warming by the sun is history now. Remember it fondly. It won't be happening again in your lifetime. The Earth is getting colder every year, and in the course of it, agriculture becomes endangered. We are now in the boundary zone that marks the interval in time between the end of the solar global warming and the start of the next ice age, in potentially the 2050s. This boundary zone is not the transition zone in which the next ice age unfolds. The Ice Age transition is an enormous event that takes us into a completely different world that no one can likely imagine. The boundary zone, in comparison, comprises the time frame of the last 5 decades of the present interglacial climate before the Ice Age transition begins. This is the time frame in which the dynamic system that powers the sun begins to weaken irreversibly. The visible results are fringe effects that appear faintly at first, but then happen ever more rapidly and with increasing severity as the system that powers the sun diminishes ever more towards its final phase shift, by which the Earth becomes rapidly transformed. Before that phase shift happens, the weakening of the system that powers the sun becomes expressed in numerous escalating climate effects that are beginning to affect our agricultures and visit our food supply. That's the time frame of the boundary zone. To put it more dramatically, in the boundary zone, our sun is dying. That's what we are facing now. There is nothing we can do to halt or reverse the process that is diminishing our sun. However, we can build us a new world with technological infrastructures placed across the equatorial seas that enables our continued living and unending development under a lesser sun. In speaking of solar global warming, I am referring to the great global warming of the Earth that saved humanity from a potential ice age transition in the 1700s, which had terminated the Little Ice Age. In the 1700s, the sun became strengthened by a plasma resonance effect within the system that powers the sun. When the resonance effect ended, the process began to unfold in reverse. In this reversal, the sun is diminished back towards the level of the Little Ice Age. and since there is little background support left in the system, the Sun will diminish beyond the little ice age into the big ice age that we had just barely missed in the 1700s. We are in that kind of boundary zone. We are presently 20 years into the boundary zone. As I said before, the boundary zone began when the last period of solar global warming ended and solar activity began to reverse. The reversal became evident in the collapsing solar wind pressure at the rate of 30% per decade by the Ulysses spacecraft between 1998 and 2008. The great global warming that had saved us from the big ice age in the 1700s had been caused by cosmic factors that had up-ramped the solar activity in a big way. This up-ramping was real. It was powerful. The resulting solar global warming gave us the most productive climate for agriculture in more than 1,000 years. That's what had ended in the 1990s. Far into the last period of global warming, the USA became created, and soon thereafter the Federation of Canada was enacted. At the same time, Europe developed its second Renaissance that may be termed the Westphalian Renaissance. This means that the climate foundation on which these nations were built upon is now fading, which endangers the nations. Unfortunately, the cosmic global warming period that was brought about by an effect within the solar system, a type of global warming pulse, within which Canada and the USA were formed and had developed, is now irreversibly ending. We simply cannot get it back. The system that powers our sun is now rapidly diminishing, as the global warming pulse is drawing to its end. With the interglacial climate having been gradually diminishing ever since the interglacial optimum 8,000 years ago, we find in ice core samples that the interglacial climate is diminishing ever more rapidly now as we are coming to the end of it. This means that the underlying support for the solar system no longer exists for a significant recovery to happen from the increasing weakening of the sun. We, humanity, certainly cannot affect this huge cosmic process by any means that we possess. So it is that from the 1990s on, we've begun to live in a boundary time zone towards the inevitable phase shift to the next ice age that we cannot escape, but which we have the power to avoid the consequences of by building us a new world with technological infrastructures that are not affected by the climate change to the next ice age, which will be bigger than any ever experienced in recorded history. We now face consequences of cosmic phenomena that most of humanity has been taught to believe will never happen. Society is stuck in this blindness for the lack of understanding of the principles that affect our climate, including the next ice age that is generally believed to be still thousands of years distant. Most of humanity has trapped itself into believing in these types of small-minded concepts. Scientists have latched onto the notion that the sun is too big to change, so that climate variations on Earth, including ice ages, are deemed to be caused purely by Earth-centered factors, such as by changing orbital variations of the Milankovitch cycle theory type, or ocean current variations and air current fluctuations, volcanic activity, greenhouse gases, and similar factors. As scientists became trapped in the mechanistic, small-minded perceptions, they have closed their eyes to the one overriding factor that is bigger than everything. This overriding factor is the solar factor. The sun is the biggest climate factor by far, and almost the only climate factor. It is immensely causative, and it is also immensely variable. That's what we have to face and respond to. Scientists have been recruited to close their eyes and to focus not on the sun as it actually is, but on small things. They have been taught the widely promoted assumption that the sun is its own master, a giant nuclear fusion furnace that is isolated from the universe and is incapable of fast variations. In the background of this small thinking, the dogma was developed that the sun is an invariable constant for all climate considerations, including the ice ages. The dogma indicates that because the sun does not change, all climate changes, without exceptions, must necessarily be caused by factors other than the sun. As the result, scientists have become a living paradox. They close their eyes to what science has revealed to be true, based on physically measured evidence, and believe instead in the opposite. A wide array of physically measured evidence, both modern and historically, has established as an undeniable fact that the sun is the big and only climate factor on Earth, and that the sun is changing rapidly, enormously, and has been changing throughout history in numerous measurable ways. Wow, let's back up a bit here and start at the beginning. It is a well-established fact that the period of the deep cooling of the Earth in the 1600s, which was the period of the Little Ice Age, had been a period of extremely low solar activity. Sunspot numbers had been carefully recorded at the time. It was noted that for nearly a century, almost no sunspots were seen on the surface of the sun. This period of extremely low and almost no visible solar activity in terms of sunspots is referred today as the Maunder minimum. Then, suddenly, as is clearly visible in the sunspot numbers counted, the sun had changed in the 1700s. The Maunder minimum suddenly ended. In the early 1700s, the sunspots were back in big numbers, and with the increasing sunspot numbers, the climate on Earth began to warm up dramatically. With the rapid revival of the solar activity, the Little Ice Age was over. With this revival of the sun, a long period of global warming began. It has also become possible in recent time to physically measure the intensity of solar activity by other means than counting sunspot numbers, and to go with this farther back in time than the sunspot numbers were recorded. It became possible to measure historic solar activity in proxy by measuring the changing ratio of two rare radio-isotopes, that of carbon-14 and of beryllium-10. The density of these isotopes in historic samples stands as a proxy for solar activity at the time the samples were created, because the sun, and only the sun, had generated these isotopes in the Earth's atmosphere, which happens when solar cosmic ray flux interacts with the Earth's atmospheric nitrogen, for example. The density of the sun-produced isotopes thereby fluctuates with changing solar activity. The fluctuation can be measured. When our sun, which is a plasma sun, is weak, it has a weak sphere of plasma around it. The plasma shield blocks a portion of the cosmic ray flux that is generated in the sun's plasma fusion cells on the solar surface. This means that a weak sun allows a larger volume of solar cosmic ray flux to penetrate the barrier, which generates larger amounts of the C14 and Be10 isotopes in the atmosphere on the Earth. The measured and plotted isotope ratios, like the recorded sunspot numbers, prove concretely that the sun is a highly variable climate factor. The measured evidence indicates that when the solar activity is weak, the Earth is correspondingly cold, which is known from climate records of the respective periods. Inversely, when the sun was ramped up in the early 1700s, the Earth became progressively warmer. The up-ramped sun gave us nearly 300 years of global warming on Earth. The warming of the Earth, ironically, was not caused by the sun getting hotter. It was caused by the stronger sun emitting less solar cosmic radiation. This resulted in less cloudiness and warmer climates. In this manner, the coincidence of the historic isotope measurements with the known historic climate records prove our sun to be extremely changeable and to be, in fact, the climate master of the Earth by changing solar activity, becoming expressed in changing solar cosmic ray flux that immensely affects our climate in a wide range of effects, such as when the global warming by the up-ramped sun had ended the Little Ice Age. The solar global warming had lasted all the way into the late 1990s, and then it ended and became reversed when the solar activity began to diminish again. The reversal is not shown here because it happened after the isotope ratios became invalid in 1945 in the wake of the nuclear bombing and bomb testing that added a new source for the radioisotope production in the atmosphere. Another radioisotope that is produced in the atmosphere by solar cosmic ray flux is beryllium-10, as I said earlier. The measurement of the production ratio of the beryllium-10 isotope, which is preserved in historic samples, gives us one more means to measure solar activity. In this case, the changing measured isotope ratios change sharply with the solar cycles, and agree remarkably close with the changing sunspot number counts. However, the isotope ratios tell us something extremely important that the sunspot numbers do not tell us. The isotope ratios tell us that the big climate changes on the Earth are the direct result of changing solar cosmic ray flux that changes inversely with the intensity of solar activity. In other words, it is the solar cosmic ray flux that is affecting the Earth and its climate in a big way. It has since been discovered by other types of measurements that the radiated solar energy does not change with changing solar activity. The sun's energy radiation fluctuates a mere 0.07%. This measured fact tells us that the immense cooling during the Little Ice Age periods, such as that of the 1600s, in which agriculture had collapsed so extensively that 10% to 30% of the population in Europe had starved to death, had been exclusively the result of very large increases in solar cosmic ray flux affecting the Earth, which is typical for an extremely weak sun, such as we had when no sunspots could be seen. That the cosmic ray increase was tremendously large in the 1600s is evident in the extremely large beryllium-10 volume in that period. Note, the isotope ratio is inversely plotted in this graphic, so that the large isotope ratios do visibly coincide with the known historic cold climate conditions. The two deep-reaching spikes, just prior to the 1700s, coincide with 30 years of no sunspots at all in the last part of the Maunder minimum of the Little Ice Age. The solar forcing of our climate is not fantasy. It is measured as solar history, and it corresponds with historic climate records. The agreement is a simple case of cause and effect. The measured solar facts are important for understanding the modern climate collapse, which needs to be understood in terms of increasing solar cosmic ray volumes that now begin to occur under the weakening sun, which are affecting our climate ever more in the unfolding boundary zone to the next ice age. We have measured huge changes in solar activity during the last 400 years. We have measured large activity increases during the global warming period, and even larger activity decreases during the boundary zone. We have also measured corresponding changes in solar cosmic ray flux that agree closely with the experienced changing climates. The connection of the sun with our climate on Earth has thereby become an established fact by real physical measurements. All the climate and ice age theories that ignore the sun as the causative climate factor have been rendered by the contrary measured facts to be but speculative theories without a foundation to stand on. The historically established facts didn't change in the 1940s when nuclear bomb testing and nuclear war created a new source for the radio-isotopes that were previously produced exclusively by the sun. The resulting loss of the measurable proxies for solar activity was overcome with a number of new forms of measuring solar activity. These new measurements, of course, were not drawn from historic samples, but were made in real time, both in space and on the ground. These new types of measurements do not detract from the historic measurements. They add to the proof that the sun is changing and is massively affecting our climate, and with it our agriculture and our food production. The result of these measurements takes us far out of the fantasy world of mainstream cosmology that regards the sun as an invariable constant and regards climate change as man-made. The real-time physical measurements reflect the principles that link climate change to solar activity. With the modern measurements now made in real time, we find the measurements reflected in real-time climate effects. Some of these now increasing real-time effects are already so extensive that they have begun to affect agriculture, food production in quite a few places of the world. In the case shown here, a massive winter blizzard had blanketed the North American grain belt with snow and deep sub-zero temperatures. But this didn't happen in winter. It happened in late spring in 2018, when massive snow was dumped onto the land as late as April, when spring planting should have been half completed, and with frosts potentially lingering into May. Such effects, though they are not critical yet, do shorten the growing season and may become dramatically critical. Furthermore, when these measured and experienced real-time effects are being projected forward, the Sun becomes recognized ever more surprisingly by the unfolding dynamics as not just being merely a variable star, but as being a fast collapsing, existentially critical climate factor for our very living on Earth. Two of the new types of physical measurements that were conducted in space in real time were conducted by the NASA and ESO Ulysses spacecraft that had measured the Sun directly from a wide polar orbit. It measured the solar activity as it happened, and it saw it diminishing, and not just a little. Its measurements indicate that the solar activity, in terms of solar wind pressure, was diminishing at the amazing fast rate of 30% per decade from the late 1990s onward till 2008 at the end of the mission. This enormous dropping off in solar activity is possible by the fact that the Sun is located within a complex dynamic system of interstellar plasma streams that power its operation. These plasma streams are focused onto the Sun by electromagnetic primal fields that form naturally by simple physical principles. As the concentrated plasma that is built up around the Sun fluctuates in density as the result of numerous resonance effects within the system, the solar activity fluctuates accordingly. That's the principle. The Little Ice Age was created on this basis, and it was terminated by global warming on the same basis, which in turn became reversed again by the now ongoing collapse of the solar activity, all by the same principle. If one projects this rate of collapse of the solar wind pressure forward in time, the interstellar powering of the Sun will have diminished to the point that the solar wind that is flowing from the Sun stops in the early 2030s when the powering of the Sun diminishes further. The solar surface temperature will then necessarily begin to diminish as the next shoe drops. And that's big. What we see happening here is enormously large in effects. Now let's consider that we are presently only halfway down that slope, even while the climate effects are already becoming monsters in some cases. The Ulysses spacecraft had measured the solar cosmic ray flux during its mission, and it saw it increasing by 20% over the same time frame, and it further measured the underlying solar magnetic field, which it saw diminishing by 30%. These two are enormously large changes in solar activity, which are bound to have corresponding climate effects. Ulysses flew 3 orbits around the Sun from 1995 to 2008, which covered in time the entire solar cycle 23, from start to finish. The solar wind pressure had collapsed 30% over this time frame. The 30% rate of collapse is also reflected in the diminishing solar cycles themselves, which evidently began before and continued after the time frame of the Ulysses mission. Other types of measurements likewise indicate that the solar activity continued to diminish past the termination of the Ulysses mission and continued so all the way to the present. This too is physical reality, measured in real time. One of the continuing measurements is conducted by solar radio observatories in the 10.7 centimeter band. The 10.7 centimeter solar flux is currently one of the best indexes for solar activity that we have. It covers more than 50 years of direct measurements. Only the sunspot number counts cover a longer period. In comparing the two, a linear relationship between the 10.7 centimeter solar flux and the sunspot numbers becomes evident. The dramatic collapse of the solar activity that Ulysses had observed between the start and end of the solar cycle 23 is seen to continue on in the diminishing solar radio flux measurements in the 10.7 centimeter band. The measurements went way above 200 radio flux units at the peak of the previous solar cycles, but at the peak of the last solar cycle, cycle 24, the radio solar observatories measured only half of the historic peak flux. A researcher, in referring to these measurements, commented, "The sun is dying." The researcher wrote, "Because the sun is operating at half power already, you can expect the sun dying when the full solar minimum hits in 2024. The sun and earth will not recover from this. From this year, 2018, forward, every year will become colder. Leave Europe within 3 years before all borders close." By Mark C. Is this type of comment justified by the measurements? Well, just look at the latest measured ratios. At the peak of the current solar cycle in 2014, a weak cycle to begin with, the solar flux was measured at 170 units. Now in 2018, a mere 4 years later, the solar flux was measured at only 68.9 units. That's a 60% drop. That's huge for such a short time. And more so if one considers that we are still potentially as much as 6 years away from the lowest point of the current solar cycle. The boundary zone to the next ice age covers a lengthy period that can be divided into 3 consecutive phases. The first phase is the phase in which the weakening of the sun, of the entire system that powers the sun, becomes expressed in diminishing solar wind pressure, while the sun's surface temperature remains constant. How is this possible? The near-constant solar surface temperature of the diminishing sun is possible because the solar wind is comparable to a boiling kettle venting off steam. It is not possible to heat water in a kettle hotter than 100 degrees at sea level altitude. When more heat is applied to the kettle, the excess heat converts water into steam, which is vented into the air. In a similar manner on the sun, when the plasma pressure onto the sun, which is its energy input, exceeds what the fusion cells on its surface require for the plasma fusion process, the excess plasma pressure is simply vented back into space and becomes the solar wind. This means that for as long as the solar wind keeps flowing, there is enough plasma density in the system to keep the sun fully powered. This also means, inversely, that when the solar wind is diminishing, the entire dynamic system that powers the sun, which focuses plasma onto the sun, is getting weaker, whereby less solar wind is vented. This type of weakening happens throughout phase 1 in the boundary zone. The radio flux that is measured with radio telescopes reflects in general the intensity of the active process by which the solar wind is being generated. The diminishing solar wind tells us that the entire active system is getting progressively weaker, and that the escaping solar cosmic ray flux that affects the climate on Earth is getting larger, with the climate effects getting larger too. Every change in solar activity affects the climate on Earth. This influence is almost exclusively the result of the effects caused by solar cosmic ray flux in the Earth's atmosphere. The influence is dramatic, and it increases with diminishing solar activity. The solar wind itself does not have a significant effect on the climate on Earth. It is slow-moving plasma in the order of 800 kilometers per second, while cosmic rays are fast-moving, high-energy plasma particles with enough punch to have that major effect on cloud nucleation. Cosmic rays are single events of highly energized plasma particles, primarily protons, that escape the solar fusion cells and then penetrate the plasma sphere around the sun, where most of the escaping plasma particles become trapped. The few that are not trapped escape into space as solar cosmic ray flux. When the escaping cosmic ray flux interacts with the Earth's atmosphere, it affects the cloud-forming process enormously by way of cosmic ray ionization. Ionized air is 100 times more attractive for the cloud nucleation process than non-ionized air. As the result of the ionization, cloud aerosols form more readily and condense more readily into water droplets, by which the clouds rain out. As a consequence of increased cloudiness, the Earth is getting colder. The white top of the clouds reflect a portion of the incoming sunlight back into space. More clouds reflect more sunlight away. The reflected energy is lost to us. The Earth invariably becomes colder in an accumulating process. This type of increased cooling by the weakening sun is ever more evident in recent times all over the world in the forms of increased snowfall, frosts, late blizzards, and so on. The increased rain out of the clouds also reduces the water transport distance of the clouds. Droughts are formed by this process, and in some cases the enhanced rainout also causes floods. The lower portion of the troposphere may contain as much as 4% of its volume in the form of water vapor. If all of that was turned into water simultaneously, the land would be covered 100 feet deep in water. Normally, only a minuscule portion condenses into clouds. But when a major cosmic ray shower erupts, typically through coronal holes on the sun, then cloud nucleation can be dramatically increased and generate flash floods right in the midst of a drought. Such an event occurred in Texas in 2015. After years of drought, flash floods erupted from Texas all the way north to Canada. These types of effects are typically produced by large solar cosmic ray events. This is how changing solar activity becomes expressed in large climate anomalies on Earth, because the anomalies are caused by the effects of changing cosmic ray flux. In fact, changing cosmic ray flux is presently the only driver for climate changes on Earth, with a few minor exceptions. Enormous climate effects can be caused by changing solar cosmic ray flux while the sun's surface temperature remains solidly constant. This means that the solar cosmic ray flux is presently the only active climate factor. And as I have said before, this factor affects us all, exclusively by its effects on the cloud-forming process. And as I have said also, changing cloudiness affects the entire spectrum of climate effects, from hot to cold, from drought to flooding, and its affects even the moderating effect of the Earth's greenhouse mantle that is caused over 90% by water vapor. So how do we know all this? We know this because we have measured it. We know that great climate changes were caused by changing cosmic ray flux because we have measured the cause for the changes in ratios of carbon-14 that is produced exclusively by cosmic ray flux. We have measured the cause for the little ice age that way and for the global warming that followed. It all comes down to one point: changing solar cosmic ray flux. Changing solar cosmic ray flux is the driver throughout the entire phase 1 of the boundary zone that is now upon us. While the diminishing solar wind pressure delineates the first phase of the weakening of the sun, the solar wind itself isn't a causative factor, but it is an indicator of how far the system has collapsed that powers our sun. Throughout phase 1 of the solar weakening, the sun maintains its surface temperature of 5,778 degrees Kelvin. Only the cosmic ray flux increases during the phase 1 period, and its effects increase with it. All of the dramatic weather phenomena that we have observed in the beginning of this phase are now becoming more prominent as we have reached the halfway point of this phase of the weakening solar system, with 15 more years yet to come, with the Earth getting colder year after year. The solar cosmic ray increase of 20% that Ulysses had measured between 1996 and 2008 appears to have grown much larger thereafter, according to more recent measurements that measure the effect of cosmic ray flux in the atmosphere. In considering that cosmic ray interaction in the atmosphere causes the release of free neutrons, the measurement of the atmospheric neutrons provides a modern real-time proxy for changing cosmic ray flux. The measurements that are conducted on this basis indicate that the cosmic ray flux had nearly doubled between the start of solar cycle 23 and the start of solar cycle 24. It may well be possible that the cosmic ray flux may double again, even before the end of solar cycle 24. That's not shown here. Should this doubling happen, which is highly possible, the climate consequences on Earth would be severely increased. If one takes a closer look at the phase 1 period in terms of measured cosmic ray flux, it becomes apparent that during the peak portion of the big solar cycles, the cosmic ray flux drops to low values. These low flux periods are effectively periods of climate warming. The progression that we see here between cycles 22 and 23 indicate that the warming periods became smaller in amplitude, while the amplitude of the cooling periods was increasing. This means the cooling of the climate is increasing overall. It also becomes apparent that the warming periods require a high level of solar activity for them to happen and to be maintained. For solar cycle 22, this condition was met 2.5 years from the start of the cycle. For cycle 23, which is a weaker cycle, the warming started 3.5 years into the cycle. But for cycle 24, for the first 4 years that we have measurements of, which includes the first peak in sunspot numbers of cycle 24, the warming that should have happened didn't happen at all. The cosmic ray values remained high all the way through to the end of the graph. It appears that cycle 24 may be already too weak for the breakout from the cooling to warming to happen. This means that we appear to have crossed the threshold already, past which the rewarming of the climate during the high portion of the solar cycles no longer happens, because the system that drives the cycles has weakened too far. If one extends the graph for the real-time proxy for solar cosmic ray flux all the way to the present, it becomes apparent that we now have passed the point where the peaks of future solar cycles correspond with periods of climate warming. While the cosmic ray flux for the current cycle, 24, diminished slightly during the peak of the cycle, its level remained high throughout the peak of the cycle and then increased again to record levels. It is this record high level of cosmic ray flux that we now experience in 2018. That's what is causing the extremely cold climate anomalies that we now are experiencing in many parts of the world, like winter blizzards in spring, snowfalls in June, and Russian tankers being trapped by sea ice in July. This means further that if cycle 24 doesn't make the grade for a climate rewarming to happen, none of the following cycles, which promise to be progressively weaker, won't make the grade either. We face a doubly critical situation here, in which increased cloudiness keeps on increasing faster, and the Earth grows ever colder at an increasing rate, since the traditional mid-cycle rewarming by periods of reduced cloudiness no longer happens. When solar energy is reflected back into space by the white tops of the clouds, the reflected energy is lost to the Earth's thermal budgets. The loss to the budget then begins to accumulate if it isn't replenished periodically. As a result, the Earth's climate is getting progressively colder, and as of recently, at an ever faster rate. That's where we are today, without a recourse in sight. This should raise some eyebrows, because the consequences are scary. The scene that you see here is scary. It is a winter blizzard scene in the middle of April in Nebraska. The scene is of a winter storm named Santo that brought record snowfall and cold across the North American grain belt. This winter blizzard, occurring in spring by the name Santo, was declared to have been the second heaviest snowstorm of all time in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It is scary to realize that this late winter blizzard was not a freak anomaly, but was merely the most recent effect of a potentially 15 years trend of the Earth getting rapidly colder year after year, after which it gets still worse. The continuing cosmic ray increase may be the reason why we are now seeing ever more strange-looking cloud formations and experience unusual climate conditions. An example is the intense cold snap across the Sahara that occurred in January 2017, which resulted in a number of pilgrims freezing to death in Morocco, who were trekking through the mountains closed for the traditional hot climate, but were not prepared for the deep below zero conditions that surprised them. Later in the same year in which the pilgrims froze to death in northern Africa, the Australian wheat crop suffered severe drought and too much heat, so that the 2018 national harvest came in 30% short. Inversely, during the years of lesser volumes of cosmic ray flux, During the solar maximum of cycle 24, the Canadian wheat farmers had harvested bumper crops in 2013 and 2014, going into 2016, because of good and moist climate conditions in these years. But now in 2018, as the solar cycle 24 is weak and large volumes of cosmic ray flux are impacting the Earth, so much so that a giant April blizzard blew across the North American grain belt. The resulting snow and freezing temperatures had delayed planting that might result in reduced harvests in a few localized areas. In most cases, the remaining growing season will likely be still sufficient to cover the needed 110 to 130 days growing period that the wheat crops require. The delayed planting places the harvest time deep into September, where early frost becomes a danger. With a bit of luck, the frosts may not happen, and all will work out this time. But what if the growing window shortens further? The growing window typically opens 6 days after the last frost in spring and closes 6 days prior to the first autumn freezing. While the current window might still be generally sufficient, it likely has become already marginal in many places. But now, what about next year? Consider that the current trend to colder climates has yet a long way to go, with the solar system getting weaker and weaker and the Earth getting colder year after year. What will happen when the growing window shrinks below what is needed for crops to grow and ripen? What will happen when this happens over a wide area simultaneously? We will likely reach such threshold conditions in 5 to 15 years. We are facing the potential of a massive climate collapse unfolding over the coming years with a severity that has not yet been encountered, except during the Little Ice Age period. Nor will we likely see a recovery from the climate collapse, because the next solar maximum for cycle 25, that might not occur until the year 2030, if it occurs at all, will likely be so weak that it doesn't affect anything. The bottom line is that the time of the big solar cycles, like cycle 22, is over, so that potentially harsh times of ever bigger climate anomalies now lay before us, with increasing drought, flooding, storms, and freezing events, all of which deeply affect our agriculture and thereby our food supply. How soon the resulting impact on agriculture will take on crisis dimensions, to the point that entire countries lose their food supply, cannot be determined. The crisis conditions may erupt as soon as 5 years from now, or maybe as distant as 15 years. The 15 years point is the point where the first phase of the weakening sun will likely end, when the solar wind pressure will likely have diminished to zero. After that, the climate collapse accelerates. That's when phase 2 of the weakening sun begins, in which the solar surface temperature diminishes, and the sun itself becomes progressively colder. No one can forecast the consequences nor the actual lengths of phase 2, which may be short in duration, or may linger on until the 2050s, when potentially phase 3 happens. The accelerated cooling of the Earth by the cooling Sun in phase 2 will likely become so severe in some of the northern regions that the snow no longer melts in the summer, but piles up and eventually buries towns and cities and breaks down houses and infrastructures. The exact timing, of course, cannot be forecast. Such details are left to speculation with a wide margin of uncertainty. But the principle is too imperative for these not to occur. Thus, they will occur. Agriculture will have stopped long ago by then, all through the climate-volatile regions. Agriculture will most likely have collapsed long before the climate transition into phase 2 happens. When agriculture stops, the greatest human migration will begin, with refugees numbering into the billions, streaming into the tropics, fleeing the crippling cold and the resulting hunger, most of them pouring into Africa and South Asia, where they would find no refuge either, as the infrastructures to support their existence do not exist. The migration of people on such a large scale is unimaginable, especially in consequences. But it will happen if a new world has not been created by then, by the affected people, which they would already occupy then. The building of the tropical world bridge, with floating agriculture and cities along the equator, is the necessary plan B for avoiding the unthinkable when phase 2 unfolds. The boundary zone ends long thereafter. It ends with phase 3, when the primofields collapse that presently focus plasma onto the Sun. When this happens, the Sun goes into a low-powered hibernation mode, and the Ice Age begins. The primofields are electromagnetic structures that are formed by large volumes of flowing plasma. When the minimal rate of flow that is needed to maintain these structures cannot be achieved, the fields collapse, and their effect, that focuses plasma onto the Sun, vanishes with them. As a consequence, the Sun becomes powered in a default manner by the unfocused plasma stream that then loosely flows around it. While the Sun will continue to operate, it will do so with a much reduced surface temperature, probably in the range of 4,000 degrees Kelvin. That gives it a 70% reduced energy output that starts the full Ice Age on Earth. When the full Ice Age is upon us under the dimmer Sun, the Earth will cool 40 times more extensive than it had cooled during the Little Ice Age. That's what we see in ice core samples. Our planet then becomes transformed into a type of desert ice planet with 80% less precipitation, except in the tropics. If we have built us a new world in the tropics by then, as a proverbial plan B, with technological infrastructures that the Ice Age glaciation cannot affect, then we will continue to live without fail. I would say, to judge by the capable creators that we have become, that this is our destiny. A potentially grand destiny the grandest ever, grander than what we yet imagine. But will we be true to what we are and reach for it? Plan A or Plan B? That's the question. Our plan for survival in the boundary zone to the next ice age is Plan B. But will we reach for it? The current plan, which is Plan A, is to do nothing. Its song is "Let the people die." The most critical aspect in the boundary zone to the next ice age that is now upon us is to choose the right plan, Plan B, and implement it quickly and decisively as time is running short. The coming ice age is assured to happen because all of the traditional recovery cycles for the sun have collapsed and are out of reach. The only long cycle that remains operational is the interglacial cycle that brings us into the next ice age. It is the ultimate cycle of the weakening system that powers the sun. The cooling of the Earth that is now unfolding in the boundary zone is not a cyclical event, as we have experienced these in the past. The historic trend of big cyclical events has diminished and fizzed out to almost nothing, and what remains is too far distant to affect us. Even the intervals between these have diminished. The global warming cycle that had rescued humanity from the Little Ice Age in the 1600s and 1700s had even then been a relatively small warming cycle. The next one promises to be too small and still too distant in time to affect us once again. For all practical purposes, the time frame of the big cyclical warming events has ended. The solar system has become too weak for these cycles to continue. The bottom line is that there is no recovery possible out of the boundary zone. Plan B is our only exit, our only recovery that is possible into a created world in which humanity is able to continue to exist and to prosper. Also, the big cooling cycles that had started 1,000 years ago have fizzed out into nothing. This means whoever is dreaming of a grand solar minimum followed by a recovery, which is much talked about and anticipated, like a temporary storm that one can weather out, is dreaming indeed. The historic minimum cycles have all diminished and have fizzed out into nothing, and the intervals between them have diminished with them. The intervals between these cycles have diminished tenfold, from 260 years between the cycles down to 25 years. They diminished in an almost geometric progression, or nearly so, as did their amplitudes. The solar system has become too weak for these cyclical phenomena to play a major role again. The time is over when we can predict the future by looking to the past. Who looks to the past is lost in dreaming. This also applies to agriculture in the boundary zone. In the boundary zone, the collapse of the solar activity is ever more accelerating, so much so that the solar system's heartbeat, the 11-year solar cycle, is slowing down. The heartbeat slowed from 11 years per cycle to 13 years per cycle, between cycle 23 and cycle 24. And the next one promises to be slower still. Even the solar cycle itself is beginning to fail. Normally, at the peak of each solar cycle, the sun's polar magnetic field orientation flips to the opposite magnetic polarity. But in 2014, only the sun's south pole magnetic field flipped, and this faintly, while the North Pole's magnetic field simply fizzed out into nothing. I have explored this fading away of cyclical events extensively in my 3-part miniseries, Grand Solar Minimum Becomes the Ice Age. And I have repeated the focus on the cyclical events being history in the video, The Ice Age is Near. We are in a boundary zone now, and as I have said before, we won't see any more decisive recoveries happening because the solar system has grown too weak for this to be possible. We can only build ourselves out of becoming trapped by the collapsing solar system, by looking forward and build on the scientific knowledge that we have gained of the solar dynamics that create now our future. We need to look at the climate events that are happening in the present and see them in the context of what we scientifically know about the weakening of the sun. It is not hard to note in this context that all the climate events that are presently happening are consistent with the changing solar dynamics and their lawful climate consequences that are experienced already all over the world in the form of increasing floods, droughts, extreme blizzards, unseasonal frosts, and so forth. Plan B becomes attractive when we consider the current fringe effects as just the beginning consequences of ever-increasing volumes of solar cosmic ray flux that escape our increasingly less shielded, weakening sun. With ever more coronal holes opening up on the sun's atmosphere, cosmic ray effects on the cloud-forming process on Earth becomes increasingly unpredictable, with large anomalous climate effects occurring. That's dangerous for agriculture because it affects the available growing season. While we cannot change the solar effects, we do have the option and the power to relocate our agriculture into the tropics where the growing season is more secure and can be totally secured by technological means. That's our plan B. That's the only option we really have. Let's look at the case of wheat. Wheat is one of the most basic foods. And then let's look at the case of Canada, which is the world's 6th largest wheat producer and one of the big exporters. For as long as anyone remembers, wheat has been grown in the 3 western prairie provinces of Canada. Wheat flourishes there because the soil is good and the growing season is sufficiently long, warm and moist for the plants to mature. As I said before, wheat requires 110 to 130 days from planting to harvest. The growing season of the provinces are sufficiently long to meet that requirement, though not with a big margin. If spring is delayed or interrupted by a blizzard, the required growing window may one day soon not happen. In such cases, when late planting occurs, the plants still grow, but they don't have sufficient growing time to mature. The maturing typically happens in July. As a consequence of rather delayed planting, the yields are smaller and the quality poorer, and more so if early frosts or snowfall wreck the harvests. Is this what happened when the big blizzard Santo struck in April and dumped up to 4 feet of snow in some places onto the fields across the North American wheat belt, with temperatures dropping low into the freezing range for many days of the month, with Canada being similarly affected? The outlook is not pleasant. The snow is real. We have come to the end of April, and the snow on the fields has not yet melted. How long can the winter wheat remain buried? How soon can the spring planting begin? Will there be enough time remaining? These types of questions should start some serious discussion about a plan B. At the end of April, for example, half the planting is typically complete, but in 2018 nothing was planted across most of the wheat growing regions, and the readiness of the fields for planting was officially considered extremely poor. No doubt, agriculture will recover from this late blizzard and others like it in the years ahead. Plants will still grow, but as the 2018 harvests might be an indicator for, future harvests will likely become increasingly disappointing, as the media like to say. Some studies indicate that an increase in global cooling of just 1 degree Celsius would shrink the area where wheat can be grown in Canada to less than half, and a further degree of cooling would shrink it to just a little bit. With the current effects being already severe, what will happen when the increasing climate collapse is beginning to affect the world's food production more substantially and worldwide? It is hard to imagine how extensively the world might change in the remaining 30 years till the Ice Age phase shift happens, unless humanity intervenes and stages a new direction for its future, with a comprehensive Plan B becoming implemented. In the early time when the USA and Canada had established themselves as nations, the sun had already been up-ramped a long way by its last global warming pulse. This means that no one remembered, even back then, what the mountain minimum was like on the American continent. Nevertheless, that's the climate that will ravish the land again in the not-so-distant future. a researcher suggests that most of Canada might have been covered in permanent snow during the Little Ice Age, especially during the Mountain Minimum period. The researcher discovered that in northern England and in Ireland, snow hadn't melted in the summer in the northern regions during the Little Ice Age, but had remained on the ground and had accumulated. He compared the current climate of this northern region with the current climate around the world. He mapped the result as two zones. His blue zone marks the area where the snow should have likewise accumulated all year round. His red zone marks the area where extremely heavy accumulations would likely have occurred. His blue zone cuts across the northern USA and encompasses most of Canada. The resulting projection illustrates to some degree where the April blizzard likely had originated that swept deep into the North American grain-growing region in 2018. It appears that to the west of the string of Great Lakes lays the cradle for the big ice sheets that likely carved out the lakes during the glaciation conditions. Since latency causes the atmosphere of our planet to flow towards the west by the rotation of the Earth, the moving air mass gets trapped by the Rocky Mountain chain in the west and then becomes forced southward by the centrifugal force of the rotation of the Earth. The outflow would then take the cold air mass across the Canadian prairies into the American grain-growing areas. This means that the longer the land masses around Hudson's Bay and in the north of it remain snow-covered during the year, the greater is the potential for very late blizzards to develop that sweep into the south late in the year, such as happened in 2018 in April. The big winter blizzard in spring, named Santo, of a type for which no official term yet exists, appears to be a new phenomena that will become more common in the unfolding boundary zone as the Earth is getting colder. It appears that when the European pilgrims landed in North America in 1620, in the midst of the Little Ice Age, they missed the big cold zone of perpetual snow, although just barely. The pilgrims had landed just south of the cold zone on Plymouth Rock inside Cape Cod Bay. Even though the pilgrims missed the brunt of the Little Ice Age, their new land was not a picnic ground for them. Plymouth is situated 42 degrees, which is the latitude of northern Spain in Europe, that had also been gripped by the Little Ice Age. In Europe, the cold outflow follows a different route. Because the cold from the large northern landmass tends to flow westward by the latency effect of the rotation of the Earth, and no obstructing mountain ranges stand in the way of this flow, the cold flows unhindered across Western Europe, affecting England in the north and the Sahara Desert in the south. This cold flow has become the source of the late spring blizzards. It has been called the beast from the east. The agricultures of Russia, Western Europe, are severely threatened by the beast, probably as severely as the agricultures of Canada and the northern USA are threatened by the beast from the north. Only the agricultures of China, Indonesia, and India are somewhat shielded from the large northern air mass, by high mountain ranges standing in the way. When agricultures fail, the world food crisis becomes unimaginable. Take wheat and corn production as an example, which is the main food crop, except for rice in the rice-growing regions. What happens when the 4 major production centers that are located in the climate-vulnerable agricultural regions experience catastrophic crop failures as the result of the now increasing climate collapse? Over 1 billion people become affected thereby. Will they simply migrate away into warmer areas where agriculture is less vulnerable to the effects of the cooling Earth, such as China and India or Africa? A mass migration on this scale is absolutely unimaginable, even into Africa. Nor is it physically possible. Neither is it physically possible for the remaining large agricultural center, China and India, to spare enough food to nourish the collapsing Western world. China and India will most likely suffer major crop losses too in the collapsing global climate. So what is the answer? Again, the answer is Plan B. No other option exists. The agricultural collapse in the climate-vulnerable areas cannot be avoided. The collapse is already beginning, even while we are only halfway into phase 1 of the solar weakening in the boundary zone, with 15 more years to go till phase 2 kicks in when things get worse. Plan B doesn't change the climate, but it enables us to live with it and flourish in spite of it. Unfortunately, Plan B requires a platform that we find hard to build. It requires the cooperative participation of all nations to build the technological infrastructures. That's where we find our greatest challenge. We are not good in the department of cooperative participation. The West champions the opposite. Imperial stealing. We fight wars not to cooperate, but to subdue, destroy, and plunder. Let's consider the Canadian Wheat Board as a tiny example. It operated as a government-run institution to support the farmers. It assured that the bulk of the sale revenue was returned to the farmers, the producers of the product. Its purpose was to assure a healthy farming industry. Evidently, under relentless pressure, the government caved in and surrendered the wheat board into the hands of some of the large international marketing cartels. As a result, the share for the farmers of the sale price was dramatically reduced from 2014 on by private profit demands. The tragedy is that when a nation no longer protects its farm industry, it gambles with the foundation for its existence. This letting go of what is vital for the sake of profit in the shadows of corruption is the kind of disease that stands in the way of universal cooperative engagement. In other words, the general welfare principle is dead, while the principle is precisely what makes a Plan B feasible. The climate collapse by the weakening sun is already beginning to bite, and in some places quite hard. Australia lost 30% of the national wheat crop in 2017 due to a drought and excess heat, which are some of the fringe effects of the increasing cosmic ray flux that affects cloud forming, cloud rainout, and reduced water vapor in the air that makes up 97% of the moderating greenhouse effect. In the same year, Europe suffered a major loss of vegetable crops due to adverse climate issues, which had led to vegetable rationing in some areas. On the American continent, the late spring blizzard Santo in April 2018 across the American grain belt will most likely result in significant crop losses in volume and quality in some areas. With these large effects already happening and the Earth getting colder year after year for several more decades to come, the complete collapse of agriculture in the climate-vulnerable regions will happen unavoidably within the next 15 years. Only the effects of the collapse can be avoided by implementing a Plan B option, such as the one that creates vast new technologically protected agricultures afloat on the equatorial sea. Such a Plan B option is quite easily implemented with large-scale automated industrial production methods and the large-scale use of basalt as feedstock and high-temperature nuclear energy to power the process. However, a new type of thinking is required in the world for this large-scale critical option to become acceptable. Society has stopped thinking too long ago in terms of its Renaissance and Industrial Revolution potential. Its thinking has become too small and encumbered with imagined limits and boundaries to what is achievable. The floating world bridge concept that links the continents across the tropical seas appears totally impossible in today's thinking. While it is more efficient than any other option contemplated, such as the 50 miles long Bering Strait tunnel link between the Eurasian and American continents. The Bering Strait undersea tunnel link that has been promoted for years would take 12 years to build, and it would require thousands of kilometers of railway to be built to link up with it, with much of it being laid across difficult terrain with harsh climate conditions. An enormous effort of manual labor would be required to build such a project. The floating intercontinental bridge, in comparison, can be easily built with uniform modules produced in automated industrial production, placed with automated equipment without the need of large labor brigades. It may well be that the 12,000-kilometer-long bridge across the Pacific will take less time to construct than it would take to construct the 50 miles undersea tunnel across the Bering Strait. The speed of the construction for the World Bridge would then be determined by the scale of the constructing industry. In this case, it's just a matter of scale. The principle of automated construction can be applied at any scale. This means that the problem that's holding us back so severely that nothing has been started yet is nothing more than a bad case of small-scale thinking. Let me present to you a simple example in principle of what can be accomplished when automated industrial production is being applied. The example shown here is that of the automated track-laying process for a new high-speed railway in northern China, a 140-kilometer rail link between the city Dangdong and Zhangjiakou that will host the 2022 Winter Olympics. The machine lays down the concrete ties and positions and fastens the 500 meters long rails onto them with the needed precision for trains traveling 250 kilometers an hour. In the past, large labor brigades had been needed to carry everything into place. Now very few people are found on the construction site, and those merely supervise the operation of the machine. Even the supplies are automatically delivered from the transport cars to the placing machine by a carrier running overhead on side rails, as the machine keeps on going and lays down 2,000 meters of rail per day. If one applies the automation principle to the larger scale of the world bridge construction, with agricultural modules extending from them, including the needed cities for them, the entire 12,000-kilometer world bridge project, spanning the seas between the continents, could be similarly completed without anyone putting a spade into the ground, so to speak, and could be completed in just a few years if the construction was carried out in numerous sections simultaneously, with the producing industries for the modules being afloat themselves. Also, as the world bridge was being built, the agricultural modules linked to it would bring large-scale food production online almost from the start, to compensate for the climate-related agricultural losses in the northern regions. By this Plan B approach, the world wouldn't run low on food when the agricultures in the cold northern regions begin to collapse, which may happen in 5 to 15 years. The world bridge agriculture, as the world bridge itself and its cities, would be cooperatively built by the whole of humanity and be never owned by anyone. It would be a joint development project of the entire world for itself, as no nation is ultimately not affected by the ongoing climate collapse, especially in later years when the ice age begins that the boundary zone takes us into. As the new agricultures develop, thousands of new cities will be linked to them for the people that operate the infrastructures and processes and the industries to support them. And of course, living in the new world would be rent-free. The concept of property lords enslaving humanity would simply fall away. The focus would then be on developing the human potential as the greatest treasure a society has. The type of money-free platform will likely emerge in due course, where advancing culture, human progress, and productive technologies go hand in hand. This is the type of Plan B option that comes into view when the boundaries of small-minded thinking fall away. Plan B would then become created as an unbounded world. Actually, the unbounded part isn't optional. Any Plan B option of the required scale and with the necessary speed of implementation can only be created on an unbounded basis, unbound from money and property concepts and society's slavery to them. A new age will then begin, designed from the start as an unbounded age of industrial and cultural revolutions, because without these, no form of Plan B is actually possible, even to contemplate. Should a Plan B not materialize, the plan do nothing would prevail, and its song, "Let the People Die," becomes the requiem for the self-termination of humanity when the Ice Age phase shift happens in the 2050s, potentially. The Ice Age will resume by the principle of the cosmic dynamics. These we have explored and measured extensively with satellites in space, measurements on the ground, in the air and ice cores, and with ground-based radio telescopes. The ending of the current interglacial epoch has been well explored and is extensively understood. There is little chance that the Ice Age phase shift will not happen, as it always has happened. The only uncertainty that remains in the entire Ice Age arena is how humanity will respond to what has been measured and is known, whether it will respond with Plan B or Plan A. That's the only uncertainty remaining at this time. At the present time, Plan A is the ruling king. Whether humanity will choose Plan B and survive depends on its success in clearing its most deadly blocking factor out of the way. This factor isn't nuclear war or financial collapse or terrorism, narcotics, migration, or even trade disputes. The blocking factor is the doctrine of man-made global warming that every nation in the world inherently bows to. It was designed from the very beginning to stand as a blocking barrier against any form of Plan B global development in response to the coming Ice Age. The global warming doctrine was invented in 1975 to overturn the concerns in the scientific community of how the world needs to prepare itself for the near Ice Age consequences. The science community saw a steady rise in sunspot activity till the 1960s, and it saw it followed by a sharp drop-off in the 1970s. The Ice Age concerns began to surface at this time. But how to prepare for such a thing? Any preparation for an Ice Age on the worldwide scale would require massive economic development. The writing for this was on the wall, so to speak. But the timing was bad. The ruling elite of the imperial oligarchies was aiming for depopulation at the time. They feared economic development like the plague. It was to be prevented at all cost to preserve the ruling imperial system. For a few pennies, they hired a group of scientists who thought up a lie, quick and slick and potent. The preposterous claim that human-produced carbon dioxide by our living on the Earth will broil the Earth, melt the ice caps, and destroy human life was dished up in 1975 at a conference in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, organized in 1974 by the influential anthropologist Margaret Mead, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The strategy was to sow enough fear of man-caused climate change to force global cutbacks of industrial activity and to halt third world development. Mead's leading recruits at the 1975 conference were climate scare artist Stephen Snyder, population fear biologist George Woodwell, and the current president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, John Holden. All three of these were disciples of the Malthusian ideologist Paul Ehrlich, author of The Depopulation Bomb. The discussion of the 1975 conference focused on the absurd choice of either feeding humanity or saving the environment. We have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we may have. Each of us has to decide what is the right balance between being effective and being honest. So spoke global warming proponent Stephen Snyder. It was at the infamous government-sponsored conference in 1975 that virtually every scare scenario in today's climate hoax took root. Scientists were charged with coming up with the science to back up the scares so that definite actions could be taken by policymakers to carry out the genocide. Global cooling, the coming of an ice age, had been in the headline in the 1970s, but since it could not be easily used to sell genocide by means of getting the citizens of industrial nations to cut back on their living instead of their advancing their development, the Ice Age concerns were buried. Behind the scene, the science community protested. They protested not to restore the focus on the Ice Age imperative. They merely protested against the unscientific assumptions of the man-made global warming doctrine. The science protest movements began in 1992. Since then, over 50,000 signatures and statements were collected in appeals and petition projects from the scientific community of numerous countries, with Nobel laureates among the respondents. But the Ice Age remained out of sight and out of discussion. The big Protests began in 1992 with the Heidelberg Appeal from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. The appeal was signed by 4,000 scientists. It was followed up in 1997 in Germany with the Leipzig Declaration project that addressed the narrow field of actual climate specialists. It was signed by 110 of these specialists. Later in 1998, the Oregon Petition Project was staged in the USA. The petition project was signed by 17,000 signatures worldwide. The project was organized in opposition of the UN's Kyoto Protocol on climate change, and it appears to have had an effect. The Kyoto Protocol eventually met with an 85% rejection across the world by 2004. As this didn't end the global warming politics, numerous open letters, including to governments, were issued in 2006 by prominent scientists opposing the doctrine of man-made global warming. Then, in the next year, 2007, the high-level UN Senate report was compiled that comprised detailed statements from over 400 prominent scientists disputing the man-made global warming claims. A year later, in 2008, a new Oregon petition project was staged online. It received over 31,000 signatures and is still ongoing. It appears in retrospect that the overwhelming consensus in the science community stands in opposition to the man-made global warming doctrine and continues so, while in real terms, the entire global warming opposition movement is actively supporting the global warming hoax by supporting its fundamental premise, the invariable sun. None of them fight for humanity by focusing on its most crucial issue. The crucial issue is that the sun is not its own master, so that it varies with external conditions which thereby affect us, including with the ice ages. This means that the invariable sun that never changes is an illusion that needs to be overcome. The invariable sun simply does not exist in the real world. The illusion of its existence is built on the prior illusion that the sun is its own master, operating disconnected from the universe. The sun is falsely perceived as an independent nuclear fusion furnace that burns hydrogen gas into helium gas at a steady, invariable rate. The man-made global warming doctrine is built on the false, steady sun premise in order that all climate changes can be declared to have been man-made, which is politically required as a factor of control. The opposition movement accepts the inverted basic model of the invariable sun. It does not dispute this model. It accepts thereby the very premise that the man-made global warming hoax is built on. The global warming opposition movement only disputes the numerous little details of false assumptions that the man-made global warming doctrine espouses, instead of it disputing the core issue, the false model of the sun that the hoax is erected on. On the resulting huge war front of science pitted against science, warring over concepts that are not real, the Ice Age focus remains completely out of sight to the present day, while the warriors remain grounded in mud, locked in a war with each other that none of them can win, as in Goya's painting. To win means to step away from the illusion that locks the opponents into war. No one speaks for humanity in this senseless climate war, much less fights for humanity, which is in grave danger on the most critical issue of all time, in the Ice Age boundary zone. No one is fighting for scientific truth in this fight. The truth of the now ever more weakening sun in the plasma-powered universe, the type of sun that we have numerous measurements of to prove it, which now endangers our agriculture, while no Plan B is presently considered to enable humanity's continued existence. Actually, it wasn't until modern time, and with the aid of space-age technology, that a scientific basis for the near Ice Age was gradually being developed. In the 1970s, the scientific community only saw the sunspot numbers sharply diminishing, without being able to understand why. The scientific data for this answer didn't exist at that time. Sure, some people in the scientific community may have had a hunch that the sun was the central actor on the climate scene and for the Ice Age. It may have been against this potential background that the Ulysses mission to orbit the sun had been vigorously pursued in the 1970s and 80s. When the Ulysses mission was finally launched in 1990, after a long struggle against budget cuts, it took another 18 years until its revolutionary measurements had been completed. That opened up a new era of looking at the sun. In the shadow of Ulysses, also some of the biggest ice quarry projects were undertaken with amazing results that did add to our understanding of the solar dynamics. Likewise did some of the largest and smallest physical experiments add immensely in recent years to our understanding of the solar system and the sun. But in spite of all these huge scientific successes, nothing came out of it that changed the world. The data became slowly buried. In spite of the immense progress that had been made in plasma astrophysics, both of the global warming camps, pro and con, remain trapped as before in this single ideological hoax that few dare to escape from, or even wish to escape from. The trap is the tightly wound knot of the hydrogen fusion model of the Sun that all bow to, while the evidence disputes it, but which is required politically. It is politically useful to declare all climate changes to be man-made, with scare stories attached, which opens the door for control over humanity. By launching its double trap of man-made global warming and the hydrogen fusion sun model, the imperial oligarchy did indeed come to own the sciences and control the thinking of society and its actions, and in doing so, indeed effectively blocked humanity's future, as every imperial system requires, for which the trap was set way back in 1975. So it is that to the present day, as from the very beginning of the global warming project, the project continues to operate as a trap, devoid of actual science and truth, but strong on control and genocide. The objective remains, and is openly stated, to promote the genocide of shutting down human development, as it had been the objective in the beginning. As of today, the objective is succeeding. This modern revelation, in this case, was announced from the very top by the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This high-level United Nations Secretary is quoted saying about the modern objective, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for the last 150 years since the Industrial Revolution." She is denouncing the model that has created the USA as a prosperous economic power, and Europe likewise in many respects, which built a foundation for humanity to become what it is and to have a future. The powerhouse for our modern living is now slated to be torn down, intentionally, worldwide, while the very opposite should be on the agenda. Tragically, the UN project is succeeding wonderfully well. The Western economics are deindustrializing, poverty is rising, infrastructures are collapsing, crime, dope, and terror are increasing, and science is so tightly tied into knots that the real astrophysical climate dynamics are completely off the table, as if they didn't exist. No one raises an eyebrow anymore in this mentally imprisoned, small-minded, top-level Malthusian world, when in the real world, human existence as a whole is in danger of the Ice Age phase shift and its consequences. Even while time is running out, No one talks about a Plan B world bridge development to assure humanity a future, being built with a super-industrial revolution, employing new energy systems, new materials, new agricultures afloat on the equatorial seas, complete with 6,000 new cities attached, rent-free, and so on, with which to assure the continued existence of humanity on the type of ice planet that the Earth will largely become when the boundary zone ends in the 2050s or sooner, and the ice age begins that no one can yet imagine, much less survive without Plan B. Nice are the eyebrows raised in the halls of the UN or in the halls of governments when the existence of entire nations is in the process of ending, potentially within the next 10 years, as is presently in progress, when agriculture will collapse and housing and transformation begin to collapse likewise, without a Plan B implemented to replace them. Nice are the eyebrows raised in the halls of the UN or in the halls of governments when the existence of entire nations is in the process of ending, potentially within the next 10 years, as is presently in progress, when agriculture will collapse and housing and transformation begin to collapse likewise, without a Plan B implemented to replace them. What is not talked about in the gilded halls yet is the truth that we would hear from the UN loud and clear if the UN lived up to its design, which it may do someday. Instead, presently, the Ice Age challenge, together with its imperative, remains hidden there, and this as effectively as when it had been buried in the 1970s, when the man-made global warming was invented and made a UN project. This sad situation will likely not change for a long time, as the UN operates as merely a debating center for a pantheon of mediocrity that is easily controlled by imperial interests. It may well be, therefore, that the Plan B infrastructures will be started on a different platform, unilaterally, as a pioneering venture by a country like China that is coming alive with creative optimism, honest science, and is, by its Confucian cultural background, committed to the advancement of the general welfare of its people and beyond that of the world. We see a bit of that already shining through on the world scene with China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Development Project making huge strides forward, which over 100 countries already participate with ever more joining. Once the already developing dynamism spills over onto the Plan B World Bridge Development Project for the security and expansion of food production and free living, millions will line up waiting to participate. Some may even drag their countries behind them, especially when their territories are starting to become disabled, as may soon be the case in Russia, Europe, China, and so on. great efficient principles founded on the tall platform of truth tend to become their own imperative and inspire the needed progress. Thus, the question of whether humanity will survive through the boundary zone into the next ice age is not an astrophysical question, nor even a scientific question, but is a question of humanity's self-perception and self-development as human beings. It becomes a question of how much value we contribute individually to our existence, to our being alive on this planet, and to being a part of this world as creators and producers and writers and artists and farmers. If we find no value in human existence or too little to bother, then Plan A will succeed by default and humanity dies. If inversely we find great value in us as the greatest species of life on the earth, then a decisive Plan B will become implemented without fail, with which a new age for humanity will begin that is not a default result, but is a created result, winged with unbounded aspirations. My perception is that a grand Plan B will become implemented one way or another, because the spirit of reaching beyond the default level to difficult challenges and near impossible adventures has always been the hallmark of our human society. We are the giant in this field, and we are awaking. Once we are awake, it will be but a small thing for this giant that we are to move with the movements of the universe and move miles ahead of it and above it, which we have the capacity to do on the wings of science unfolding.